Hello and welcome to what is part number 2 of the 100 Years' War, the very history of England and France. Now, if you haven't watched part number 1 yet, I suggest you stop what you're doing. Go watch that video first. The link is in the description down below of this video. And while you're there, please consider liking, commenting, and most importantly, subscribing. And also, you can hit that notification bell so you know when my next video is out. Let's get into this. With Edward III, the King of England, and his army marching through France using the fire and sword tactic, burning and murdering everything that came in their way. But then all of a sudden, England was thrown on the ropes by Philip VI of France, as he took over the English land of Gascony in France and installed a blockade in the English Channel, stopping merchant ships getting their textiles to the markets in Ghent. And it stopped any reinforcements coming in from England to aid the now stranded English armies in France. In 1340, Edward was getting really frustrated because he couldn't get to France. His advisors even told him that the French navy was twice the size of the English navy, and any attempts of crossing the Channel would be suicidal. Edward, however, was stubborn, and he was a bullish man, and he refused to listen to them. So along with his navy and a few merchant ships, he set out and attacked the French navy. To everyone's amazement, Edward broke through the lines, broke through the blockade, and landed in northern Flanders. 18,000 French soldiers lost their lives at sea. Success on the seas didn't always mean that you'd have success where it mattered most, on land. And Edward was stone dead broke. The Italian banks had been bled dry by this point. So Edward went to his parliament and asked them for a special war tax, who turned round and told him he shouldn't have started this war, it is too expensive, and we will not vote in this special war tax. Edward needed a way to persuade his parliament and get everyone on his side so he could get the real gears of war rolling forward on the war machine. He surrounded himself with the very best that he could find, and he made them all captains. And there's a few charismatic characters in his captaincy. You have Walter Manny, who was an absurdly violent man, and he was fearless, and he rallied his troops who would follow him anywhere. You have Henry Lancaster, who was a noble and a cultured man. He even wrote a book called The Holy Medicines, and he would methodically think of every tactical aspect possible. You have Capital de Buch, who was the leading cavalry master of his age. Along with all of these amazing leaders, Edward's army started to win against all odds in Brittany. The French were fighting at home, they had more numbers, they had more armed knights, but the English were becoming the victors. Now, how were they managing to have all of the success, even though that the odds were definitely not in their favor? Well, the majority of medieval wars were won when the one army had more heavy armored, chivalric, aristocratic knights on horseback, and they would go charging into the enemy and split their lines open due to their sheer weight. But Edward took this unwritten rule and snapped it in half, and he made his heavily armored knights fight on foot. They didn't charge. Instead, they waited for the enemy to come to them. The enemy would be encircled because there would be archers that the enemy wouldn't have seen on the flanks. Now, even the archers were different because almost every other European army used crossbows because they were easier to produce and anyone could use them. But the English used longbows, a 6-foot bow that needed a skilled archer to use effectively. Luckily, the English had a tradition where fathers and sons would go practice their archery skills weekly. The longbow also had a longer range than the crossbows. It could penetrate everything except for the very best armor. It was also faster at its firing rate, firing 6 arrows per minute. Edward would teach the wealthy European chivalric knights, decked head to toe in armor, that they would be beaten by these light-armored peasants with longbows. Things were once again looking up for Edward, except for his crippling debt that sent 2 Italian banking houses into bankruptcy because of this massive debt. And England had been fighting for years. By 1345, they had almost nothing to show for it. And by 1346, Philip of France had got his act together and gathered an enormous army to drive the English out of the country. So what Edward did is he was backed into a corner, but he went all in. He spent every little bit of borrowed money that he could get his hands on, and he invaded Normandy with a smaller army that was less equipped than that of the French. His plan was to enforce fire and sword once again, burning everything that he could and marching towards Flanders and combine their forces. When he landed in France, the French were waiting for him and they chased him. As the English made their way to Flanders, they realized that the Flemish had gone back on their word. They had decided they weren't going to join in the fight after all. Any normal leader may have taken their losses, left France and regrouped, but this was Edward III, and this was his last hope. Edward and his army decided they were going to turn and make their final stand. Edward also had his young son with him, the 16-year-old Prince Edward, who had been known as the Black Prince. And the 2 armies engaged near Crecy on the 26th of August 1346. It would finally see the battle, king versus king. The Black Prince was also given command of the left wing of the battle line. Now Philip, the French king, didn't wait for his whole army to arrive. Remember, they were chasing them. And he saw his army was double the size of the English. So he ordered an attack immediately with the crossbows and the peasant forces rushing towards the English line. But before they could even get in range of the English line, the English sent thousands of longbow arrows, blocking out the sun and raining down terror. Philip was so angry at this, he ordered the very best of his nobles to charge through on their horseback and smash through the English lines. Again, the longbowmen sent a storm of arrows shooting down the horses. Now remember, the English army wasn't very well equipped, and these longbowmen had to run into the field and get their arrows back so they could shoot them once again. And while they were in the field, they decided they were going to just slash the throats of the French knights in a bloody melee. The French weren't going to stand back and let their countrymen die, and they were actually incredibly brave. There was even the blind King John of Bohemia, who called 2 of his courtiers to tie their horses to his, and they charged off into battle. By the end of the battle, the 3 had lost their lives, but they didn't lose each other, as they were all still tied together. Despite this absolute mayhem and massacre, the French knights on horseback actually made it to the English line, where they were met with the English knights on foot, and the English knights wouldn't budge. But they were still being pressured. The young 16-year-old Black Prince, Edward III's son, was under such great pressure from the French knights that one of his commanders ran to their king, Edward III, and asked for reinforcements, or he may lose his son. Edward III replied, "Tell my son it is his chance to win his spurs," which meant the young Black Prince, at 16 years old, was all on his own, and he didn't break. Edward knew it was crunch time. So he sent his mounted knights on horseback around the French mounted knights, and he cut them down from the backside. The French then fled. They ran away. This sealed victory for the English, and it sent shockwaves through Christendom as their so-called strongest nation, the superpower of the day, had been beaten by a much smaller, less well-equipped, backwater country like England. Amongst the dead and mutilated bodies, Edward III went to his son, the Black Prince, and praised him for his bravery, telling him that he was worthy of being his son and worthy to rule the land. Now, you have to think here. It seems like murdering your way through northern France was actually quite a good time to build a father-son relationship, apparently. And the 2 decided they were going to go and attack the fortress of Calais. Now, why go to Calais when you have just won a vital battle against the French? I mean, the French king was there and they still lost. Well, England didn't quite have the manpower to capture the real French crown and its capital city, Paris. But Calais was the porthole city to the English Channel and therefore worth it. Now, they besieged Calais and its fortress. And Calais resisted for months, hoping that their king Philip would come and aid them. But then they started to run out of bread. Then they started to eat horses instead, but they ran out of those. They started to eat dogs instead, but they ran out of those. And then they ate rats. The people became desperate, and 500 elderly and sick and weak were expelled from the fortress. But the chivalric code states that no one can breach your line, so the English didn't kill them. They let these 500 innocent bystanders starve to death in a no man's land. Calais was truly desperate, but Edward didn't want to massacre the populace. But they had also defied him. They didn't want Edward to be there. So what he did was he forced the leading townsfolk to beg for their city, but Edward was so annoyed that they had to fight him. He said they all had to be executed. Here is where we see the first of many influential women step into the 100 Years' War. Edward's queen, Philippa, who was born a French princess, told her husband he better not kill anyone, and the unbending King Edward bent to the will of his wife. Now, the real role of a medieval queen was to intervene so that the king could show mercy without being perceived as weak, and Philippa played her role perfectly. Edward and his army would go on to take the city of Calais, and England would keep Calais for another 200 years. The loss of the city was described as a dagger aimed at the heart of France. Now Edward went home as the victorious king, and he partied. But the party was about to welcome an unknown guest, a little bacteria called Yersinia pestis. This little bacteria lived in the intestines of fleas, and these fleas lived on rats. These rats lived in the thatched roofs of medieval houses, and they would hide away on merchant ships, meaning that they could travel. These little fleas would bite humans as well, and Yersinia pestis would travel into our lymph node system and use it as a highway around our body. It would destroy the human immune system, leaving our bodies unable to fight against the bacteria, and cause black boils which would burst from the skin, hence the common name for the illness, the Black Death. The bubonic plague. You may feel as fine as possible in the morning and be as dead as a dodo in the afternoon. The Black Plague would see the populations drop. 45% of the English population was killed off. 2 million people remained in England. Europe was affected as well. 30 to 50% of the population died, depending where you were. How did this affect the war? Find out in part number 3. I really hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, the more you know.